Parliament just voted on critical amendments to the Renters' Rights Bill, and the decisions they made are going to reshape the entire UK rental market. Whether you're a landlord watching your investment options disappear, a tenant struggling to find pet-friendly accommodation, or a student wondering where you'll live next year, what happened in that chamber affects you directly. And here's the thing nobody's talking about. The amendments that were supposed to make renting fairer might actually make everything worse. The Renters' Rights Bill has been racing through Parliament at breakneck speed, heading straight for Royal Assent where it becomes law. But yesterday's debates were the last chance to fix some serious problems with how this legislation actually works in practice. MPs had the opportunity to listen to landlords, tenants, and housing experts who've been warning about unintended consequences. They had data showing what happens when similar policies rolled out in other regions. They had real-world examples of how this bill could backfire spectacularly. And they voted down almost every single amendment that would have made this legislation work in the real world. Let's start with the pet deposit decision, because this one reveals exactly how disconnected these policies are from reality. The proposed amendment would have allowed landlords to request an additional 3 weeks' rent as a deposit when tenants have pets. Not required, just allowed. Landlords could choose to accept it or not. Tenants could choose to pay it or look elsewhere. Simple market dynamics giving both sides more options. Parliament voted it down completely. Now here's why this matters more than you think. Under the new bill, landlords can't advertise properties as no pets allowed anymore. You won't see those Rightmove listings that say no pets, no DSS, no children. That becomes illegal. Landlords have to consider every application, including those with pets. Sounds great for pet owners, right? But think about what actually happens. A tenant with a dog now has to apply to dozens of properties without knowing which landlords are genuinely open to pets and which ones are just going through the motions because the law requires it. They waste time on applications that were never going anywhere. They compete against non-pet owners who'll always seem like the safer choice to a landlord with no extra security. Meanwhile, landlords who might have been on the fence about accepting pets, who might have thought an extra deposit makes the risk worthwhile, now have zero incentive to say yes. No extra protection, same risk, why bother? The amendment would have given landlords a reason to accept pets and given tenants with animals more genuine options. Instead, Parliament created a system where everyone pretends to consider pets while actually making it harder for animals to find homes. The student accommodation situation is even more baffling. Right now, student HMOs, houses with multiple unrelated tenants, can operate on the academic calendar. Landlords can get their properties back between academic years and rent to the next group of students. That's staying in place. But what about landlords who provide student accommodation in one-bedroom flats or two-bedroom apartments? They do the exact same thing, renting to students on academic cycles, but their properties don't qualify as HMOs. The amendment proposed a specific ground for possession that would let these landlords operate the same way, giving notice aligned with the academic year so they can keep serving the student market. Parliament rejected it outright. The arguments against it made no sense. MPs acknowledged that blocking this would push landlords out of the student accommodation market entirely. They admitted some areas already have student housing shortages. They heard evidence that this would make the problem worse, and they voted no anyway. What happens next is predictable. Landlords with smaller student properties will switch to standard long-term rentals because they can't deal with the uncertainty of not knowing when they'll get their property back. Universities in towns that already struggle with student housing will face a crisis. Students will end up commuting longer distances or paying premium rates for the limited accommodation that remains. Councils will have to step in with emergency measures. And in 2 years, those same MPs will act shocked that student accommodation disappeared exactly like everyone warned them it would. Then there's the reletting restriction, which might be the most economically illiterate decision of the lot. Under the current bill, if you give your tenant notice because you want to sell the property, you can't relet it for 12 months if the sale falls through. The amendment proposed reducing this to 6 months, which is already a significant penalty for a landlord who's lost half a year of rent. Parliament kept it at 12 months. Let's walk through what this means in practice. You're a landlord and you decide to sell because interest rates have made your mortgage unaffordable, or you need the capital for something else, or you're just done with the regulatory burden. You give your tenant proper notice. You list the property for sale. But the market's slow right now. Stamp duty just increased. Interest rates are still elevated. Unemployment's rising. Properties below £200,000 are moving, but even that market's sluggish compared to previous years. Your property sits on the market for months. No viewings, no offers, nothing. Meanwhile, you're paying the mortgage with no rental income. Some councils are charging double council tax on empty properties. You're watching cash drain away while rental demand in your area is through the roof because there aren't enough properties available. The obvious solution is to put a tenant back in while you reassess your options. But you can't, not for 12 months. You have to sit there losing money while tenants desperately search for somewhere to live and your perfectly good property sits empty. The argument that a landlord would put a tenant through this disruption just to raise the rent slightly is absurd. 6 months of lost rent wipes out years of small rent increases. But Parliament decided that phantom problem was more important than the real problem of rental properties sitting vacant during a housing shortage. The penalty system controversy shows how far removed this legislation is from basic legal fairness. Under the bill, landlords can face fines up to £40,000 for violations. The amendment proposed that these penalties should require criminal standards of proof, meaning beyond reasonable doubt, before someone loses that kind of money. Parliament rejected it, keeping the civil standard, which is based on the balance of probabilities. That's a much lower threshold. In practice, this means a landlord could be hit with a £40,000 fine based on evidence that wouldn't be strong enough to convict someone of a crime carrying a £100 penalty. The argument for this was that it would be too hard to enforce the rules otherwise. But that's essentially admitting the system is designed to penalise people without being certain they actually did anything wrong. It's a revenue generator dressed up as consumer protection. Now let's talk about what happens next, because the timeline on this matters enormously. The Renters' Rights Bill is heading to Royal Assent, which is the final step before it becomes law. But becoming law doesn't mean everything changes overnight. If you want a preview of how this rolls out, look at the Leasehold Reform Act. That became law over a year ago. Since then, only a handful of minor provisions have actually been implemented. The rest is still being phased in, waiting on secondary legislation, stuck in government departments, figuring out how to make it work. The Renters' Rights Bill will follow the same pattern. Some changes will come fast. Rolling tenancies for new agreements will probably be implemented quickly because they're straightforward and don't require major system changes. Landlords just stop offering fixed terms and everything becomes periodic. No big infrastructure needed, minimal disruption, easy win for the government to say they're making progress. But Section 21, the no-fault eviction provision, that's the centrepiece of this entire bill? That's going to be delayed for years. The court system isn't remotely ready to handle the volume of cases this will create. Right now, Section 21 allows landlords to regain possession without proving grounds, which keeps a huge number of cases out of the court system entirely. When that disappears, every single possession case goes through the courts with landlords having to prove specific grounds for eviction. The courts are already overwhelmed. Wait times for hearings are measured in months, adding thousands of new possession cases that now require full hearings, and evidence will break the system completely. The government knows this. Housing experts know this. Court administrators have been screaming about it. So Section 21 will get pushed back with excuses about needing to ensure the system is ready, needing to hire more judges, needing to streamline processes. Meanwhile, landlords will be stuck in limbo, unsure whether they can plan for Section 21 still existing or prepare for a world where it's gone. That uncertainty alone will push more landlords to sell up and leave the market entirely. Here's where the market impact gets really interesting. The government keeps insisting these changes will stabilise the rental market and give tenants more security. But every single landlord organisation, every property expert, every housing economist has been saying the same thing. This will reduce the number of rental properties available, and we're already seeing it happen before the bill even becomes law. Landlords are selling in record numbers. The private rental sector is shrinking. And it's not because landlords are greedy or heartless. It's because the math doesn't work anymore. Higher mortgage rates, increased regulations, removal of tax deductions, and now a bill that makes it nearly impossible to manage risk or get your property back when you need it. At some point, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. What's particularly frustrating is that Parliament had all this information. They heard testimony from landlords explaining why they're leaving the market. They saw data on rental supply declining. They listened to tenants describing how hard it is to find anywhere to rent. And their response was to reject amendments that would have kept more landlords in the game and more properties available for renters. The pet deposit amendment would have encouraged landlords to accept tenants with animals. Rejected. The student accommodation ground for possession would have kept smaller properties in the student market. Rejected. The 6-month reletting period would have kept properties from sitting empty. Rejected. Every single measure that would have increased housing supply got voted down in favour of theoretical tenant protections that reduce the number of places tenants can actually live. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. This bill is being sold as pro-tenant legislation that will make renting fairer and more secure. But if you're a tenant right now, your biggest problem isn't that your landlord might serve you a Section 21 notice. Your biggest problem is that there are 10 other people competing for every halfway decent property that comes on the market. Your biggest problem is that rents are skyrocketing because demand massively outstrips supply. Your biggest problem is that landlords can afford to be incredibly picky about who they rent to because they have so many options. The Renters' Rights Bill does absolutely nothing to address the supply problem. In fact, it makes it worse by giving landlords more reasons to sell up and fewer reasons to stay in the market. And let's be clear about what the next few years look like. The bill becomes law, probably within the next few months. The easy provisions get implemented quickly, things that don't require much infrastructure. Then we wait. Section 21 gets delayed because the courts aren't ready. During this waiting period, more landlords sell up because they're operating under increased regulation without even the basic protection of being able to regain their property efficiently. The ones who stay in the market become more selective about tenants, more cautious about any risk factors, more likely to reject anyone who seems like they might be difficult. Rental supply continues dropping, rents continue rising. Tenants with pets, tenants on benefits, tenants with any characteristic that seems risky, they all find it even harder to secure housing. Eventually, Section 21 disappears and possession cases flood the courts. Wait times for hearings stretch from months to years. Landlords who need to sell their property for legitimate reasons, maybe they're retiring, or facing financial hardship, or dealing with a family emergency, they're stuck with tenants they can't remove through any reasonable time frame. Some of those landlords will face financial ruin waiting for courts to process their cases. The stories will be heartbreaking. Pensioners losing their retirement income, families unable to move for work because they can't sell their rental property, people driven to bankruptcy by situations that would have been resolved in weeks under the old system. And Parliament will express surprise that removing the safety valve created all this pressure elsewhere in the system. Student accommodation will be the canary in the coal mine. By the next academic year, Universities in certain areas will be reporting shortages. Students will be posting on social media about having nowhere to live. Local news will run stories about young people commuting 2 hours each way or sleeping on friends' couches. Councils will hold emergency meetings about the crisis, and the connection to yesterday's vote, to the decision to reject ground for possession for student landlords, that'll get memory hold. Politicians will blame greedy landlords or insufficient university planning or anything except the policy decision that directly caused the problem. The empty properties penalty will create its own special kind of chaos. Imagine you're a tenant searching desperately for somewhere to live. You know there are properties sitting empty because landlords tried to sell them and couldn't. You know the rental market is tight and you'd happily rent one of those places. But they're locked away, unavailable, because a landlord who already lost 6 months of rent has to lose another 6 months before they're allowed to help you. It's madness. It's a policy that hurts landlords and tenants simultaneously while achieving absolutely nothing positive for anyone. But it's staying in the bill because Parliament decided that theoretical concerns about landlords gaming the system were more important than practical concerns about housing supply. What makes all of this even more frustrating is that there were good amendments mixed in with the bad. There were proposals that genuinely would have protected tenants without decimating the rental market. Stronger enforcement against genuinely rogue landlords who let properties fall into disrepair. Clearer processes for tenants to challenge unfair rent increases. Better protections against retaliatory evictions when tenants complain about legitimate problems. Those kinds of measures would have improved the rental market for everyone. But they got lumped in with the ideological stuff, the provisions that treat every landlord like a potential criminal and every tenant like a helpless victim. And it all became this massive package where Parliament felt obligated to pass everything or nothing. The thing is, most landlords aren't sitting on property empires. They're ordinary people who own 1 or 2 properties. Maybe they inherited a house from their parents or bought a flat as an investment for their retirement. They're not property moguls with legal teams and property managers. They're regular people trying to navigate an increasingly hostile regulatory environment while providing housing that people desperately need. And this bill treats them all like the enemy. Every provision is written as if landlords are constantly scheming to exploit tenants, as if the relationship is inherently adversarial, as if the only way to protect renters is to assume the worst about property owners. But here's the reality that doesn't fit the narrative. Most landlord-tenant relationships work fine. Tenants pay rent, landlords maintain properties, everyone goes about their lives. The problems that make headlines, the nightmare landlords who refuse to fix broken heating or try to evict tenants illegally, they're the minority. They're the cases that need strong enforcement and serious penalties. But this bill doesn't target enforcement at actual bad actors. It blankets the entire sector with restrictions and penalties that assume everyone's guilty until proven innocent. And the landlords, who are doing everything right, who are providing good quality housing and treating tenants fairly, they're the ones most likely to decide this isn't worth the hassle anymore. So what actually improves the rental market for tenants? More properties available to rent. That's it. That's the answer. When supply increases, rents stabilise or decrease. Landlords have to compete for tenants instead of tenants competing for properties. Good landlords who maintain their properties well and treat tenants fairly can attract renters even if their prices are slightly higher. Bad landlords either improve or lose tenants to better options. The market naturally rewards good behaviour when there's actual choice involved. But we're moving in the opposite direction. Every policy decision, every regulatory change, every tax adjustment pushes more landlords to exit the market. And that gives the remaining landlords more power, not less. It makes tenants more desperate, not more secure. The Renters' Rights Bill needed to focus on supply. It needed measures to encourage more people to become landlords, to make the sector attractive to investors who would increase housing stock, to streamline planning permission for converting properties to multi-unit housing. It needed to make being a good landlord easier and being a bad landlord harder. Instead, it made being any kind of landlord harder. It added costs, increased risks, removed tools for managing those risks, and created uncertainty about future regulations. And now we'll spend the next 5 years watching the rental market deteriorate while politicians act confused about why their pro-tenant legislation made it harder for tenants to find homes. The most depressing part is that this was all predictable. Every single consequence we're talking about was raised during the consultation period. Housing experts submitted evidence. Landlord organisations provided data. Even tenant advocacy groups pointed out that reducing supply would hurt renters. The information was there. The warnings were clear. And Parliament did it anyway because the political optics of being tough on landlords were more important than the practical reality of keeping people housed. That's what happened in that chamber yesterday. That's what those votes meant. This bill is heading to Royal Assent. It will become law. And then we'll watch it roll out in slow motion, each new provision implemented with great fanfare while the market continues shrinking. In a few years, when rental properties are even scarcer and rents are even higher and tenants are even more desperate, there will be calls for more regulation, more restrictions on landlords, more penalties and fines. Because the narrative will be that landlords are causing the problem by leaving the market, not that the regulations push them out. And we'll do the same thing all over again, adding more restrictions that drive out more landlords and hurt more tenants. If you're watching this as a landlord, you already know what you're probably going to do. You're running the numbers on whether it makes more sense to sell now before prices drop further or wait and see how bad the implementation really is. You're looking at your mortgage costs versus rental income and wondering if the stress is worth it anymore. You're thinking about how much simpler your life would be if you just got out of the rental market entirely. And that's exactly the problem. We need good landlords to stay in the market. We need people willing to provide housing. But we're creating a system that punishes them for doing exactly that. If you're watching as a tenant, especially if you have pets or you're a student, or you're on benefits, or you have any characteristic that makes you seem slightly risky, the next few years are going to be rough. The competition for properties is going to get fiercer. The requirements landlords demand are going to get stricter. The rents are going to keep climbing because there simply aren't enough places for everyone who needs them. And the bill that's supposed to protect you is going to make all of that worse. That's not pessimism, that's just math. Reduce supply while demand stays constant or increases, and prices rise. It's the most basic economic principle there is, and Parliament is ignoring it completely. Now, look, I want to hear from you on this because it affects all of us differently depending on where we sit in the market. If you're a tenant, are you seeing these effects already? Is it harder to find places that accept pets or consider benefit claimants? Are you competing with dozens of other applicants for every property? If you're a landlord, are you considering selling up? Have you already made the decision to leave the market? What was the final straw that pushed you over the edge? And if you're just someone watching the property market trying to understand where it's all heading, what do you make of these decisions? Does any of this make sense to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely want to know how this is playing out across different parts of the UK and different types of situations. Before you go, if you found this breakdown useful and you want to stay ahead of every development in the UK property and housing market, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Every single one of you helps us keep bringing this analysis to more people who need it. When the next update drops about Royal Assent or implementation timelines, or court readiness, or any of the 1,000 other things that'll affect how this bill actually works in practice, you'll get it immediately. And smash that like button as well. It genuinely helps push this content to more people through the algorithm. And right now, we need as many people as possible understanding what's actually happening with rental legislation. The next video on this will likely cover the Royal Assent process and the first implementation dates, so keep an eye out for that. We'll break down exactly which provisions hit first and what you need to do to prepare whether you're a landlord or a tenant. This is Property Reporter, bringing you the latest UK property and housing news without the political spin, just the facts and the analysis of what it actually means for your situation. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.